Today we're going to cover the autonomic nervous system. But remembering, of course, that when we're thinking about the autonomic nervous system, we can't really separate it away from the CNS or the sensory division or the peripheral nervous system, because lots of sensory information, that's your afferent division, is always coming in via the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, where it's all getting processed. And when that information has been processed, it obviously has to come out again through our efferent division, and the efferent division splits. And the efferent division splits into our somatic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system is controlling skeletal muscle, so we have conscious control over that on the whole. But it also splits into our autonomic nervous system, which I want you to just think of as automatic. Okay, we have no conscious control over our autonomic nervous system, or our visceral nervous system, as some people will call it. And that autonomic nervous system is further split into the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. Parasympathetic is all to do with rest and digest, so it's all about resting, and it stimulates the homeostatic mechanisms within your body within that resting state, so it'll slow your heart rate, for example. The sympathetic division is all to do with fight or flight, so that will alter your homeostasis so that your heart rate increases, for example. So really, what is the autonomic nervous system doing? Well, it's maintaining homeostasis. In other words, it's regulating our internal environment. It innervates our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. That's our internal viscera. So the smooth muscle may be in our blood vessels. It may be in our GI tract. The cardiac muscle is obviously in our heart. And then we have the glands, the sweat glands, the salivary glands, for example. And what it's doing is always making adjustments, fine adjustments, to ensure that we have optimal support for our body activities, whether we've just eaten or whether we're going out to exercise or whether something scary is happening. And it's operating subconsciously. We have no control. It's involuntary. So first of all, the somatic nervous system. So remembering what happens, sensory information comes in through our peripheral nervous system, processed in our CNS, comes out through our efferent, and some of it, information goes to our somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system innervates our skeletal muscle. So therefore, the axons of the somatic motor neurons extend out from the CNS to the effector, which is our skeletal muscle. And we have conscious control over that on the whole. There's the odd reflex that we cannot, under any circumstances, control. For example, the knee-jerk reflex. But most reflexes we can control if you really, really want to. You can consciously control them. So, for example, if you put your hand on something really, really hot, your subconscious is telling you to lift, lift, lift. Your conscious is telling you to lift, lift, lift. But if you really, really want to, you can keep your hand on there. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could theoretically do it because you have conscious control over your skeletal muscle. But the other division is our autonomic nervous system, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on today. Oh, sorry, just a quick thing on the somatic nervous system, just as a by the by, all our somatic motor neurons, they release acetylcholine to activate nicotinic receptors on skeletal muscle. Okay, so you need to know about a small subset of neurotransmitters and a small subset of the various receptors. And acetylcholine and the nicotinic receptors are very important ones in multiple systems. So keep those into your head. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go on to the autonomic nervous system. And as we've said, that is divided into two key divisions. You've got the parasympathetic nervous system. That's promoting your maintenance activities and it conserves your energy. It's all about rest and digest. So following a meal, for example, you're in that rest and digest, your parasympathetic nervous system activity dominates. Okay, and this is an example of this is the 3 Ds. It directs digestion, diuresis, and defecation. So one of the good reasons, if you think what it's stimulating or directing, it's directing digestion, diuresis, defecation. So you have a meal. The 3 Ds start to kick in, so you're resting a little bit more. Your blood pressure goes down, your heart rate drops, your respiratory rate drops. Your GI tract activity starts to increase. Your pupils become constricted, they're more relaxed. Your lenses become more accommodated for close vision. It's actually a very good time for reading because of the accommodation within the eyes that is going on. But it's also why you don't really want to exercise straight after a meal. Your parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in after the meal. You go and exercise, you're trying to stimulate your sympathetic nervous system. So now you're trying to exercise, but you're also trying to digest your food, so neither of them works particularly well. They're in balance, and you actually want your parasympathetic to be predominating when you've just had a meal. And then you've got your sympathetic nervous system, and of course that is mobilizing your body during activity. So it provides those optimal conditions for an appropriate response to a threat, or if you're exercising, or whatever situation, stressful situation it might be. And it directs following exercise. That is stimulating your sympathetic system. Excitement, emergency, embarrassment. Think about all those effects. What happens to your heart rate? It goes up. What happens to your breathing rate? It goes up. All manner of things will go up. Blood pressure will also go up. So, for example, during exercise, vigorous physical activity, you're getting a blood shunt to the skeletal muscle and to the heart. That's being stimulated by a sympathetic nervous system. It's causing dilation of your bronchioles. You're getting more air coming in. That is being stimulated by a sympathetic nervous system. And it's stimulating glycogen breakdown so that you've got glucose stores ready to use in your skeletal muscle, but also to be released into the blood from the liver. So it's really stimulating an increase in your heart rate. It causes that dry mouth. Think about the embarrassment or the stress that you're under when you're giving a presentation that you may not be prepared for, or you're just nervous because you're giving a presentation. You get a dry mouth. You get your cold, sweaty skin because you're sweating, part of that sympathetic nervous system. But also, it's cold because initially, at least, you vasoconstrict to the skin. Less blood goes to the skin, so it gets colder. And it dilates your pupils. Your pupils enlarge out, so more light can come in, and your brain can process all that extra information that is coming in through your eyes. But at the same time, it dampens down those non-essential activities. You don't need your GI tract motility going on during exercise or excitement or emergency or embarrassment and stressful events. So it dampens down your GI tract. It dampens down your kidney function. It dampens down your gonad function. They are non-essential during the sympathetic nervous system. Remembering, of course, about all of this, it's rarely all parasympathetic or all sympathetic. We're in a dynamism between the two systems, and there's a continual fine adjustment. As I said, your parasympathetic does predominate at one point, and your sympathetic does predominate at other points, but we're in fine balance most of the time. So now we've got to think about the structure of the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system uses a two-neuron chain. Here's our central nervous system, okay, where the information is coming out from. And the cell body, there it is, of the first neuron is in the central nervous system. Okay, this is called your preganglionic neuron. It's using a two-neuron chain. This is the first of them. It is the preganglionic neuron, and it's in the CNS. The cell body of the second, or rather, the cell body is. The cell body of the second motor neuron, which is here, this is your postganglionic neuron, is in what's called an autonomic ganglion outside the CNS. And follow my little mouse, that whole thing there is your ganglion, your autonomic ganglion. And in there you've got lots of cell bodies and lots of synapses between dendrites and cell bodies, and between the joining parts. So basically that is your ganglion, and that is outside the CNS. So preganglionic neuron, postganglionic neuron. And as you'll know, it's divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, both of which have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. And you've got your sympathetic, fight or flight, and your parasympathetic, rest and digest. Now, what neurotransmitter do these release? Well, it doesn't matter whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, they both release acetylcholine from the preganglionic neuron to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And then the postganglionic neuron synapsing with the effector may release acetylcholine, which actually happens in some systems in the sympathetic and all, in fact, of the parasympathetic, and noradrenaline for other parts of the sympathetic nervous system. But we'll come back to that later, okay? Because they can either also be stimulatory or inhibitory, and that depends on the receptor that is present on the effector. But back to the structure. So if we're looking at it in the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia, which is this green thing, remember where the cell bodies of the postganglionic neuron accumulate, they're close to the spinal cord. So remember, here is your preganglionic neuron, releases acetylcholine and here is your cell body, of course, and this is your autonomic ganglia. And the postganglionic neuron is very long as it stretches out to the effector. In the parasympathetic nervous system, here we have it again, the ganglia this time are very close to the effector, so the organ that it's going to, or they may be within the structure itself. So we have a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron. So there are differences, key differences between the structure of the autonomic ganglia between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So remembering the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, remember we have neurons that are innervating the effectors over which we have no control. So it's all about the smooth muscle, heart, and the glands. Now here is your brain, okay, very crudely drawn, I admit, and I do apologize for that. Here's your brainstem running down into your spinal cord with the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. You can see how it's labeled: red, sympathetic, greeny black, was green initially when it was drawn, is your parasympathetic, and you can see that they're coming out from different points. Now what I want you to do is just have a look at this diagram and do a comparison of where the sympathetic fibers are originated from and where the parasympathetic fibers are originating from. Press pause, okay, so because I'm going to carry on talking. So press pause, have a little bit of a think, work it out, where are they coming from, and what can you remember about the lengths of the preganglionic and the postganglionic fibers? Okay, so back to it. So what I want you to really think about here is we're looking at the sympathetic first. And what you can see from the sympathetic is that they're originating in the thoracic and the lumbar regions of the spinal cord, in particular between T1 and T12 and L1 and L2. The other important thing to note, on the whole, there is one exception that we'll talk about in a second, is that the preganglionic fibers are short, and the postganglionic fibers are long. Remembering the neurotransmitter being released from there, and there is, question mark, think about it, acetylcholine. Okay, so short preganglionic fiber, long postganglionic fiber, with one exception, and that's when we're stimulating the adrenal medulla. So this is one part of the sympathetic nervous system that actually never developed postganglionic neurons. Instead, it formed an endocrine gland, and that's the adrenal medulla. And on activation, the adrenal medulla secretes about 80% adrenaline and about 20% noradrenaline into the bloodstream, plus a few other little molecules in small amounts. Okay, so it's only got a preganglionic fiber. There's no postganglionic fiber there. If we then look at the parasympathetic nervous system, again, you should have worked this out. You can see that they're originating from the brainstem, so specifically these cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, 10 being the vagus nerve, so you must know about that one, of course. And also from sacral, the lower regions, S2 to S4. The important thing, again, is you've got long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers, which synapse, and these autonomic ganglia, okay, where the neurons meet, basically, they are either within the effector organ or very, very close to it. Remembering the sympathetic nervous system on the whole is running down the sympathetic trunk. So it's a sympathetic trunk running down the spinal cord. So looking at it in a little bit more detail again, but it's very similar to that high quality drawing that I've just shown you. We're looking at the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, having a look where we are on the left-hand side, we've got the parasympathetic nervous system. If you want to, press pause, have a good look at it, fully understand what's happening with the structure, the length of the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons, what neurotransmitter is being released between the two, and do the same then with the sympathetic nervous system. Really have a good look at it and analyze what's going on before I just give a quick overview on it. So here we have the parasympathetic, and again, as you're seeing, you've got some of them coming out from the brainstem, okay, through the cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, which is your vagal nerve. Okay, and they move to the eye, they move to the salivary glands, to the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. They've all got long preganglionic fibers, as you can see there, with short postganglionic fibers. The autonomic ganglia of some of them are just outside the effector organ, others of them are within the effector organ, but they all release acetylcholine. And then you've got the bladder. coming from the sacral regions, S2 to S4, you've got the bladder and the genitals. And again, long preganglionic fibers synapsing in the autonomic ganglia, in this case, within the effector organs with short postganglionic neurons. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding that. And as I've said, they're extending out from the central nervous system in each case, almost to the target organ, and they synapse with terminal ganglia or autonomic ganglia close to or within the target organs. And as I've said, they have a short postganglionic fiber which synapses with the effectors. So if we're thinking, just as a quick overview for you, what each of these cranial nerves actually is involved with, well, if you're looking at cranial nerve 3, it's all to do with oculomotor, so constriction of the pupil. If you're looking at cranial nerve 7, for example, that's facial, so it's about saliva, tears, taste, and facial expressions. You've got cranial nerve 9, which again is saliva, swallowing, and taste. And then you've got the vagus nerve, number 10, which does a huge array of things. But it's synapsing or talking to the lungs, the heart, the GI tract, swallowing. It helps to regulate blood pressure. It does all manner of things. And then, as you'd expect from S2 to S4, we're looking at the bladder and the genitals. So it's all about erection, clitoral engorgement, and release of urine, obviously, as well. So it's all to do with, and then at the same time, I'm not going to go through it yet because we'll do it later, but you might want to think about what the parasympathetic nervous system is doing to each of these systems, what it's doing to the eye, what's happening to the type of saliva you get for stimulating parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest. And you can compare it to what happens to saliva from the sympathetic. If you're nervous, you get small amounts of really thick saliva. What happens parasympathetic? It becomes really runny. Okay, so you can start to think about the differences in the functions. What happens in the heart? Parasympathetic decreases. Sympathetic increases heart rate. Okay, so you can start to think about the functions at the same time, and we will cover it later. So now we're going to move on to the sympathetic nervous system, and really I'd like you to do exactly the same as you just did thinking about the parasympathetic nervous system. I want you to think about where is it innervating, what is the length of the preganglionic, the postganglionic neurons, which organs is it innervating that the parasympathetic doesn't. There are a couple of organs that where you don't get that innervation, where you get more innervation of the sympathetic rather than the parasympathetic. And it is more complex because it innervates more organs. Okay, as I've just told you, it innervates more organs. And I'll give you a clue, I don't even know if it's on here, but sweat. Okay, so it stimulates, there you go, you've got skin. So it stimulates sweat production, which the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't. There are others. There's the adrenal gland. It stimulates the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline. The parasympathetic does not stimulate that. And there are others, okay, which we'll go through later. So again, have a little bit of a look and think about what the structure is and what's happening. So as you can see, if you remember what happened, it's a lot more complex. Okay, it supplies the internal visceral organs. There we are, our internal visceral organs, and all visceral structures in the superficial somatic part of the body. In other words, the sweat glands, the erector pili muscles, and the smooth muscle of blood vessels, both deep and at a superficial level. So it's allowing vasoconstriction and vasodilation of our blood vessels. Okay, which again, the parasympathetic nervous system does not innervate our blood vessels, with one exception, which again, we'll talk about later. But for all intents and purposes, it's our sympathetic nervous system that is innervating the smooth muscle of our blood vessels, allowing them to vasoconstrict and vasodilate. So even though the sympathetic nervous system, as you can see from this, only really originates from T1 up to L2, the sympathetic trunk, as you can see, which is this, there's your sympathetic trunk, that runs down from the neck to the pelvis. So it is actually much longer than where the origination comes out from. And as we've talked about, you've got these short preganglionic neurons, with the exception of the one going to the adrenal gland, okay, which is longer because it's got to make its way all the way to the adrenal gland, and long postganglionic neurons. There, just follow my little arrow. They're all very, very long. Okay, apart from the adrenal gland, which doesn't have any postganglionic neurons because it is stimulated by the preganglionic neuron to release adrenaline, noradrenaline, and a few other things into the blood. Okay, so I've got some review questions for you. So really, I just want you to look at these review questions and just tell me, in each case, true or false. Okay, so hopefully you paused it and you've had to think about this. Which of the following are correct regarding the autonomic nervous system? A 1 or 2 chain efferent neuron chain exists. On the whole, that is inaccurate because it is just a 2 chain efferent neuron. Okay, you've got your preganglionic neuron and your postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic, postganglionic. There is one exception, of course, and that is the one going to the adrenal gland. We only have a preganglionic neuron. So really, it's a 2 chain efferent with the exception of the adrenal gland. The preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies in the central nervous system. That is correct. Look at where they are. Cell body, cell body, cell body, cell body, cell body, cell body. Our preganglionic neurons, the cell bodies, there they are, running down the spinal cord there and down to the sacral, are all within the central nervous system, either in the brainstem or different regions of the spinal cord. Next question. There are neuron cell bodies in the ganglia outside the central nervous system, in the sympathetic nervous system, but not in the parasympathetic nervous system. That's incorrect, because of course there are neuron cell bodies in the ganglia outside the CNS in both the sympathetic nervous system and in the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, the ganglia, they might be in different places. Here are your sympathetic ganglia. Follow my mouse again, running down the sympathetic trunk. They are, and there your ganglia. There's a ganglia, parasympathetic, 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 parasympathetic. It's basically where the pre and postganglionic neurons meet. So they are outside the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system innervates skeletal muscle. That is incorrect. It's your somatic nervous system that innervates your skeletal muscle system.